Hello and welcome back to General Humanities I. Today is our first look at the cultures through the lens of a PowerPoint presentation. Hooray. So, we have an actual video today. Today we're going to be talking about ancient civilizations, all of the super ancient civilizations. And this is going to come with some caveats. First off, I gotta stress again, I'm a philosophy professor. This was not my area of expertise. I do not know about archaeology all that much. I've studied archaeology sort of indirectly from the discussion of ancient Greek. But I definitely don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to all of these other crazy ancient cultures like Babylon and Egypt and Medo-Persia and half of what we're going to be talking about today. Again, I've picked this up along the way largely because I've been teaching humanities classes for a while now, and it's sort of something you just have to learn and pick up at some point, especially when I started studying things like Gilgamesh or Persian philosophy, which is very much out of the realm of the usual beaten path here. But in my experience with General Humanities II, I usually like to structure classes like these big survey classes that look at the whole of human history, as though I'm telling a story. And again, since I don't know that much of the nitty gritty archaeological details or the specific historical elements, I can't recount to you all of the different dynasties of Egypt or all of the rulers of Babylon or, half of the stuff that anyone who really does know what they're talking about here would be able to tell you. I try to structure it as a story. I'm just telling you the story. We don't necessarily need to pick up on all the details of the dates and times, but, we'll cover the broad details, get the major plot movements out of the way, and hopefully present it in a way that's interesting and narratively compelling to boot. But that kind of left me with a big question on this one. Okay, so where do we begin? The trouble with talking about these really ancient civilizations, literally the first civilizations of the Western world, is that there really isn't a great starting point. When it comes to the story of human development, you can go real far back. As much as this is a cave painting from 32,000 BCE, well out of the scope of the usual discussion of Western civilization, really this is recent by comparison to hey, let's talk about when hominids started being a thing. Let's talk about the human ancestors, and we could look at the archaeological record of early stone tools and stuff. And I am definitely well out of my wheelhouse if we start talking about it from that perspective. So we're gonna instead kind of focus on civilization as civilization. Remember, this is a humanities class. We are here to talk about the humanities, by which we mean history, literature, music, art, architecture, to some degree history and politics, and maybe a little anthropology, but not a whole lot of anthropology. Consequently, our story really should start when we start seeing civilization proper, when, cities start to crop up, and when people are organizing themselves into governments and bureaucracies, and, when they have enough leisure time on their hand to develop things like literature and culture. That's what interests us in this class, so logically that's where we would start. So, sorry, 32,000 BCE, kinda not within our purview on this one. We're gonna start closer to 3000 BCE. But this is not the only one of our caveats today. We also got to talk content warnings and stuff. We've read the Gilgamesh at this point, so we've already seen some of this stuff at work. But I imagine, you're coming to this class thinking to yourself, shit, are we gonna do another only white dudes class here where we're only gonna talk about emperors and conquerors, and it's all about great awesome dudes, and specifically white dudes, and this is Western history, so it's not we're going to be including China or anything. What about marginalized groups? Are we going to cover them at all? And there's a mixed bag of answers here. So on the one hand, okay, what about women? Are we going to cover women in this class? Yes, question mark, but I warn you that they're not gonna be in positions of power as a rule. yes, there are going to be significant women over the course of history. We're even going to bump into a couple of them today, like Hatshepsut, the pharaoh queen of Egypt, who contracts for herself like a really impressive palace. But yeah, it's not going to be terribly often that like women like this are going to be in positions of power. We're not going to be talking about them nearly as often as we're talking about men. As much as women are indeed 50% of the world in the ancient world as well as the modern world, they're not going to be getting 50% of the airtime as far as our conversations go. Honestly, as much as I want to talk about the role of women in society and how that has changed over time, I am more inclined to do that in the literature discussions and in the philosophy discussions than I am likely to do that in the history discussions. Mostly because I feel more comfortable talking about them in the literary world. Like, by all means, we're going to spend some time talking about, like, how does Homer portray Helen, or how does Andromache get presented, or, under different circumstances, maybe we'd talk about Penelope more, and whether or not that's just another branch of misogyny, or whether that's actually something, like, progressive as far as Homer goes. It's complicated, it's messy, sure, but at the very least, like, women are characters. So, yeah, I'm more interested in talking about the role of, say, Ishtar and Gilgamesh than I am in trying to, like, shoehorn the accomplishments of women into our discussion of ancient cultures when the ancient cultures in question largely ignored them. I could find exemplary women to bring into the class, but at the end of the day, it would feel a lot like tokenism, and we don't have a whole heck of a lot of time for me to, like, specifically go out of my way to spend 10 minutes talking about, hey, here are some cool women doing cool things at the same time as all of this stuff that you need to know. It sucks. There's no good way of doing this, I think. The fact of the matter is, we're getting our history from the ancients, and the ancients don't think women are important. So, sorry, ladies. Again, women will come up, but usually in some pretty specific contexts. So you might very well then ask, okay, so what about, like, black people? What about marginalized groups? What about racism? Are we going to be discussing any of that? And I have good news on this one. Yes, in fact, like, probably the majority of people we're going to be talking about during this lecture are, in fact, not white people. They might not necessarily be black people specifically, but the whole question of race is kind of not a thing here in the ancient world. Like, as much as, yes, the story of Western culture has been very much Eurocentrized and whitewashed, and we'll bump into that over the course of our discussions, and we will, in fact, talk about that in more detail later. I want to stress that the idea of, like, there being racism in history is kind of nonsense when you're going as far back as we are in this discussion. Like, yeah, the Romans were probably, by contemporary standards, straight up white. But they probably also had a lot of black people running around just because the whole Roman Empire extended over a pretty broad area. And as much as the Etruscans and the Romans were prioritized among the rest of the Roman civilization, people became citizens under strange circumstances in ancient Rome. And as a rule, the Romans didn't really have, like, specific prejudices against black people. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of Africans, we're going to see a lot of people from the Middle East, we're going to see a lot of people from Turkey, we're going to see a lot of Eastern Europeans, and they're all going to largely kind of just get along. Like, they're not going to get along all the time, they're going to definitely fight and have wars with each other, but those wars are not going to necessarily be based on racism, they're going to be based on xenophobia. And I want to make that difference clear here. Like, as a rule, these ancient cultures tend to be pretty cosmopolitan. You're going to have people from all over the world bumping into other people from all over the world. Trade is necessary in the Bronze Age world, and consequently people from Greece, and people from Egypt, and people from Nubia, and people from Anatolia, and people from the ancient Near East, and people from Persia are all going to be, like, hanging out together and getting along together, and nobody's going to be picking fights with each other just because you look different than one another. There's actually a fairly modern argument that is being made, like, over the past 50 years or so, that racism kind of was an invention of white Europeans trying to justify slavery, like specifically the North Atlantic slave trade. And there's actually a lot of water that argument can hold. The fact of the matter is, the Greeks didn't care if you were black or white. What they cared about was, can you speak Greek? Like when the Greeks talk about, quote, barbarians, and they literally coin that term, that is a Greek word, they're talking about people who don't speak the Greek language, because any language that doesn't sound like Greek sounds like bar, 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 bar to them, apparently. So that is extremely reductive, but it's not necessarily racist. So glass half full, I guess? You're going to see a lot of xenophobia in this class, is what it comes down to. People basically thinking anyone other than us is weird and different and bad. But it's not going to necessarily fall upon racial lines. If you are willing to speak our language, learn our culture, we are perfectly happy to be friends with you. That seems to be the perspective of most of the ancient world. But this might naturally beg the next question. Okay, so what about slavery, Professor Kozlowski? Is slavery a thing? Yes. Yes, slavery is a thing. It is kind of going to be a constant assumption of this class that the cultures we are talking about are economically structured around slaves. And yes, that sucks, but I have some glass half full optimism on this one as well. Slavery is so entrenched in the ancient world that it does not have nearly the stigma and definitely not the sort of horrible circumstances that we see in, say, the North American slave trade. Slavery has been a thing for thousands of years. Many great empires and cultures are built on the backs of slaves. Those are pretty value neutral, pretty apolitical statements. It is the case that that was happening. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, they build their civilizations on slavery. It is a thing. But again, the slavery isn't rooted in racism. It's not like, they are black and therefore inferior to us and therefore we can do whatever we want. That was the justification of the North American slave trade, and it led to black people really being dehumanized. The thing about the ancient world is that slaves were considered human, and they were treated fairly decently. There are exceptions to this case. The ancient Spartans, in particular, treated their slaves like absolute shit. But they, as a rule, were probably the closest thing to being as bad as, white slave owners owning black slaves in the Deep South in the 18th century and 19th century. I know that this is going to sound weird, but that level of barbarism is a modern invention. Now, there are other horrible forms of barbarism and savagery in the ancient world, like the fact that the Romans consider any confession not made without torture to be irrelevant. The Romans basically think that if you don't torture someone, they can't possibly be speaking the truth. You've just got to torture them for formality's sake. That sucks. That's awful. Good thing we stopped doing that. But in the case of slavery, you'll find that actually a lot of people end up in slavery for perfectly decent reasons. People will often sell themselves into slavery to get themselves out of a particularly sticky economic situation. And consequently, slavery is something that is, in many cases, temporary. Some people are conquered in battle and become slaves for life, but even then, if they manage to, distinguish themselves significantly, oftentimes they can rise up the ranks. There is, in fact, social mobility for slaves in a way that there simply wasn't back when slavery was based on race in the 19th century. So, slavery, yes, but awful, horrible treatment of slaves, less so. Hooray, I guess, question mark. Finally, you might ask, okay, so what about sexuality? Alright, so we get that it's going to be, a melting pot of cultures, sure, fine, whatever. Are people nearly as tolerant about people with different sexual preferences? Pass. In all honesty, this one is real complicated. Different cultures have very different priorities as far as sexuality is concerned. Some are extremely restrictive, like the Jews. Some are extremely tolerant, like the Greeks. Some have pretty strict understandings of when homosexuality is acceptable, often in war. Some have comparatively liberal attitudes towards sexuality. This is one of those places where the historical record really isn't clear, and consequently there's a lot of room for interpretation. And there seems to be a lot of that going on. Like, you'll find, and we'll sort of bump into it along the way, certain contemporary scholars who are interested in sort of reinterpreting history through a queer lens are going to sort of like find space for queer communities to exist within the usual narrative of history. And there will often be pushback against this, but it really comes down to how do you read your history, not so much like a whole bunch of cultures in the ancient world saying, no, we're totally gay and fine with it. The truth is, again, ancient cultures were probably more tolerant of homosexuality and homoeroticism than contemporary cultures today. Again, weird how we pride ourselves on being so, like, progressive and tolerant when, in fact, we may just be recovering from some really bad choices over the last 500 years or so. But in this particular case, it's really not clear. It's not in the historical record, and therefore it is really just a matter of conjecture whether or not there were thriving queer communities in ancient Babylon or something. Occasionally we'll get reports. When we do, it's often from the Jews getting really judgy about it. But even then, like, that doesn't seem to be definitive for the entire ancient world. So maybe we're certainly going to run into some very prominent queer relationships over the course of this class, and we're going to again find space for others as we go, but it isn't necessarily something I'm going out of my way to talk about again. It is something that we'll bump into along the way. If you have questions about it, by all means, ask me about it, send me an email, bring it up in class. I'd love to talk about it more whenever I've got information to give you. But broadly speaking, again, this one is going to be very dependent on time and place. Some cultures will be tolerant, some cultures won't be tolerant. Sometimes we'll be more tolerant, some other times we'll be less tolerant. There's a lot of different factors involved here. So at this point, having talked about all of the misogyny and all of the xenophobia and all of the slavery and all of the potential intolerance of different sexual lifestyles, you might well ask me, well, Professor Kozlowski, why the hell are we studying this then? All of these people are backwards and horrible. Like, they are often terrible. You literally just told us about the Romans torturing people. At which point I would say, yeah, I get it. But I also think that the idea that we are living in a, progressive and accomplished world, like we've put all of this behind us, is reductive. History is more complicated than that. And as much as, especially in the modern era, like progressives and liberals like to talk about, how far we've come and progress, and especially like people love to throw around the, history will remember this, history will judge you for this particular decision. It doesn't necessarily. History is more cyclical than that. As much as we might think that, like, the progress of history is towards greater tolerance, greater acceptance, greater, redress of injustices and a greater sort of more utopian society, in actuality, empires rise and fall, and the values of one culture may very well be overcome by the values of the next, and you cannot easily say whether one is more progressive than the other. Where slavery is destroyed in one part of the world, a new crop of misogyny will spring up, or vice versa. So I think it's valuable to study this stuff, if only because it'll give you different answers to the question of how should society be organized, and whether or not progress can even be understood in some linear fashion. But also B, it might very well prepare you for some of the truly heinous, awful stuff that is going on around us right now, and that may very well be going on around us in the near future. And if you think I'm getting political, yeah, don't worry, it's definitely in the back of my mind too. But more than that, I mean, like, hey, slavery is happening right now, just not necessarily where you live. And the things that we have, become fairly tolerant of, as I said before, may actually be better than what slavery was once upon a time. So why do we study all of this stuff? Because it'll give us better understanding, both of the times past, both of the and of the way that they are now, as well as both of, the present and what we assume about the world, and the way it could be different. History is informative in a wide variety of ways, and I tend to think that the studying of humanities is valuable in ways that cannot be easily quantified. The theory here is that I'm giving you different ways of looking at the world. You get to approach the world and say, that doesn't have to be that way anymore. Whether it is because there's rampant misogyny going on around you, or because there are narrow understandings of sexuality or race, or just because you might very well question, hey, what other alternatives do we have to our current economic arrangement, or our current government arrangement, or the way that our basic family is structured? I want you to ask those questions, and I want you to recognize that the things that you think are right and good and just the way things are may be none of those things. So cut me some slack, and hopefully it will pay off as time goes on. I can't necessarily make guarantees. Again, there's going to be a lot of misogyny and a lot of xenophobia and a lot of slavery and a lot of narrow-mindedness between now and the end of this class. But if you are willing to wade through it with me, I promise you I will be able to show you something that you didn't expect at some point. And if all goes well, maybe even change your mind about some things. So, content warnings out of the way, consider yourself properly prepared. Let's talk about this actual story that we're getting into here. Again, as I said, I don't want to start back in like the, early hominids era, and I don't want to talk about the geological ages of the earth, and I do not want to talk about like the sort of incremental developments in stonework or tool making between Paleolithic man and, like Neolithic man and so on and so forth. That's not my area of expertise. That's kind of not what this class is supposed to be doing. Instead, I do want to kind of frame it in terms of this Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age distinction, with the recognition that we're going to start like pretty well into the Stone Age. Like, we're going to be looking at the Neolithic era as our starting point here. And sort of talk about like the Bronze Age as we kind of wander our way into it. So what I want to sort of use as our starting point, like, okay, so where do we start? Where does our conversation about human civilization begin? Well, with the city part of civilization, with the people settling down and starting to make large groups of themselves, with people organizing themselves and getting to greater levels of sophistication because it is necessary to do that. And that means we got to talk about the agricultural revolution. We have to talk about when we go from, like, hey, a whole bunch of people who are gathering or herding or hunting, all of which are perfectly respectable ways of living, by the way. Like, gatherers tend to do pretty well for themselves, as much as it kind of sucks to, like, have to wait and see whether or not, all the plants are going to flower the way that you hope that they will. And herding is arguably even more stable, like even better. You've got this constant source of meat just always hanging around, and livestock tends to be considerably more resistant to sudden changes in the environment. The downside of herding, of course, is that, like, you gotta, find new pasture land. When your sheep or cows or whatever eat all of the grass, you gotta go somewhere else that there is grass and keep on moving. Not great for building civilized city-based societies. The alternative, of course, is hunting, and there are some really great hunting civilizations as well who do just fine, but now, once again, you're following the herd. You're, not in control, even less than you were for the herders, but, now you're just at the whims of whatever your buffalo or whatever your wild boar are doing, and again, that doesn't make for a terribly stable or secure lifestyle. Agriculture isn't necessarily an improvement as far as producing food is concerned. Like, it's way more labor intensive than gathering, and it is every bit as subject to famine and, sudden changes in climate or sudden changes in the environment. But what it does mean is that you're in the same place all the time. You're going to plant crops where you are over and over and over again, year after year after year, and for that matter, you're going to get more yield in certain places. Like, as much as most agricultural, like, cultures do not end up getting past subsistence survival, in certain areas of the world where agriculture is especially plausible, where there's abundant water, where irrigation is especially easy, not only can you produce enough food for you and your family, you can produce enough food for you, your family, and a bunch of other people, which means that all those bunches of other people can spend their time doing other things than agriculture, like, for example, planning your city or planning the irrigation habits or planning the organization of your agricultural work, which actually makes life easier for all of you farmers, which means that more yield, more people can be supported with fewer laborers. The benefits keep on yielding in this case. So this enables people to build cities. This enables societies where there are devoted artisans or artists, where there is a ruling class of bureaucrats or scribes. This is what enables the possibility of writing. This is what enables the possibility of organized government and hierarchical organization. Like, it's still rudimentary at this point. I'm not going to over-exaggerate it here, but agriculture offers a lot more than many of those other lifestyles do, just because it offers a level of stability that those other lifestyles do not. But, like I said, it depends on where you plant. Which brings us to, where do you plant? Now, as we've said, this class is going to focus predominantly on Western culture. Again, this might very well seem arbitrary to you. You might very well ask, well, why don't we study ancient China? Or why don't we study, African cultures? Why don't we study, ancient India? Because it is every bit as old as many of the cultures here in the West. Well, because we're in America and because we draw our, assumptions about the world from Europe, which drew its assumptions about the world from ancient Greece and Rome, which drew its assumptions about the world from Babylon, Egypt, and this is what we mean by the West. So those are the civilizations that we're going to be focusing on here. In this discussion, we are going to focus on the three primary Bronze Age civilizations that have the largest reach. Specifically, the one in Babylonia in the Fertile Crescent, where the Mesopotamian Tigris and Euphrates kind of meet and make for especially fertile agricultural ground. Here in ancient Egypt, where the Nile floods on a regular basis, and consequently you can use that to irrigate the shit out of your crops and make for a very productive lifestyle. And here in ancient Greece, where, let's be perfectly honest, agriculture kind of sucks. We do not have nearly the kind of irrigation strategies and stuff, but it is centrally located with the other two cultures, and it's kind of got its own cool stuff going on. So as much as subsistence agriculture isn't something they're going to overcome very easily, nonetheless, there's enough about their lives that are good enough that they can, make their culture and, trade for all the things that they need. We'll be talking about the Greeks quite a bit, after all. So these are the three sort of poles we're going to be focusing on for the first part of our discussion. And again, you'll notice that they tend to be focused around major agricultural centers. Heck, over here in the Indus River, you've basically got what is effectively the same situation. And again, this is why these are the three most ancient civilizations, the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, like Bronze Age 3000 BCE and just after that. Which, we have more questions about the scope here. Give it a minute, we will get there. For now, I want to sort of take each one of our three major civilizations in turn: Babylon, Egypt, and Greece. And again, we're going to start in Mesopotamia. We're going to look at the Babylonian culture first. In part because it's almost certainly the first that arose. In part because it is going to be one of the mainstays that we keep coming back to for a few weeks here, and in part because our first reading circulated around it, namely the Gilgamesh. Again, the kind of key to Mesopotamian culture is that we've got the Tigris and the Euphrates. These two major rivers that make the entire area very fertile, very easy to plant crops here, or herd, or whatever you feel like doing. This is why we call it the Fertile Crescent. If you draw a line all the way from the Persian Gulf through the, Tigris and Euphrates River, and then down all the way through Israel, where there's other rivers that are sort of connecting this, all the way down to the Nile. This is the Fertile Crescent. This is the cradle of humanity. This is where civilization really gets started. The word itself, Mesopotamia, literally means between the rivers. So you'll notice that like all of the major population centers, all of these cities, some of which hopefully you'll recognize, tend to be located between these two rivers, especially near one or the other river, where the land is fertile, where agriculture is very possible, where, like the regular irrigation is doable and where it can conceivably yield like greater agricultural yields and thus support more complicated civilizations. Now, the Mesopotamian culture, we should stress, is more complicated than just being one culture. This one's messy and will get messier as time goes on. The first culture to really control the Mesopotamian world were the Sumerians, and the Sumerians are shockingly inventive. Like, we're going to talk about the whole Sumerian legacy in a moment, so, hold up on that. But the Sumerians are, like, proto-scientists. They're the ones that kind of invent writing for all intents and purposes. Yes, there are other writers in other parts of the world. They're not necessarily the first writers, but they're the first writers in the ancient Near East, and it's going to be their ideas that get copied by literally everybody else. But the Sumerians very much get conquered in like the 2300s BCE by the Akkadians, who are much more militaristic and who basically just like cut through the Sumerians like a knife through butter. But the trick is that the Akkadians, they don't have a terribly strong culture of their own, so they basically just adopt everything that the Sumerians have been doing, and basically they just like announce that they are landlords of this area rather than like totally displacing the Sumerians or destroying their culture. The Akkadians basically take the cuneiform writing that the Sumerians have developed and apply it to their own language. No harm, no foul in some respect. But now that we have Sumerian technology paired with the Akkadian lust for power and expansion, gradually we're going to increase the boundaries of this new empire that we're building until we start calling it the Babylonian Empire, a sort of fusion of the Sumerian and Akkadian perspectives, which will then be sort of like one of the great powers of the ancient world. Now, the Babylonians are also complicated. They will sort of fracture and fragment. The Assyrians are one of the groups that are sort of going to both invade and also sort of fall away from the Babylonians. Though, at this point, we're talking about post-Bronze Age collapse, and we need to, like, hold off on that for the time being. You'll notice in this timeline, like, 3000 BCE to 2340, not a whole lot of details about why there's a gap there. 2100 to 1792, not sure what the story is between those, like, 300 years or so. But the biggest and most obvious gap is between 1750 BC and 900 BC. We'll talk about it. That's going to be a big deal. For now, let's talk about the individual cultures, the sort of gradual, snowball effect that brings us from Sumer to Babylon. And again, like I said, the Sumerians are sort of the primordial inventors of language in the region. They have a basic pictorial alphabet, but that pictorial alphabet gets pretty readily modified. The Sumerian writers who sort of like pioneer this language, they are essentially like bookkeepers. They're tracking like how much grain or how much stuff is being deposited in the local temples and the big centers of commerce and, bureaucracy. And consequently, they figure out pretty quickly that, these pictures are great, but like when you're actually just tallying over and over again, day after day after day, it's way easier, like, based on their system to just, like, rotate the tablet and, like, make little tally marks, because if you write left to right instead of top to bottom the way you're supposed to do, then there's way less risk that you're going to, like, accidentally bump your clay tablet and smudge everything that you've done and lose an entire day or week's worth of work. So they quickly rotate the tablet, and then, like, they'll have a symbol at the top, like, hey, this is the number of fish we have. And then they, like, rotate the tablet and then make all the tally marks going from, like, the fish down. So it's like, doot, 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 doot. But eventually, by, like, the time that the Akkadians take over and the early Babylonian culture is being formed, we're less interested in the actual, like, symbol and more interested in just like, hey, we've got a tradition here, let's keep identifying that. And at this point we have new tools, these fancy reeds that we use to like make the imprints instead of just drawing lines, like sketching them on the clay tablet. It's way faster, way easier to use these reeds. So now we're using these little symbols, like the little lines with the little triangles in the end. This is how we're going to draw our pictures now. So the pictures are less important than the fact that we can make them quickly. And you'll notice that once we're down to read marks in the tablet, little lines and stuff, it pretty quickly transforms to the point that now we don't need the picture at all. We can purely abstract everything that has gone on before. But notice that there is that gradual transformation. From here is our picture of the ox with the triangle and the two little horns, to putting it on its side for easier use, to let's make it a little abstract so we can, like use our fancy read tools, to making it more and more abstract and easier to write, at which point you can see how we might get an A out of this, like a lowercase a with a little round thing and then a little thing at the end. Hey, look, that's the Greek alpha. Just a little bit more imagination necessary here. The read marks, the little lines and stuff, this is what we call cuneiform writing. The sort of runic writing that you see in a lot of like the tablets of, especially the Middle Bronze Age and beyond. Like by the 2nd millennium BCE, this is what Sumerian/Babylonian writing exclusively looks like. And you will find it all over any kind of Babylonian like device or record or whatever. Which brings us to the scientific developments here. The Sumerians had actually developed some pretty sophisticated ways of observing both the weather and also astronomy, and consequently they had like calendars where they were tracking, the progress of the moon, and this was used to help like figure out the planting cycles. This is one of these early Sumerian star charts or calendars, which both shows us like where all of the celestial bodies are supposed to be, as well as what that means in the calendar. The Sumerian calendar was based on a 13-month system. Like basically it was purely lunar calendar. Like they didn't really concern themselves with, whether or not it was consistent every year. They were more concerned with like making sure that it was consistent every month. Which means that like their overarching calendar was missing a few days, or arguably was a little too long by several days. But apparently they had some way of solving that. I'm not sure what it is, because again, this isn't my area of expertise. Moving on. Again, this is where we get the Gilgamesh from. Like, the text that we used to talk about the Gilgamesh, the Sinleki Anuni, like, standard Babylonian translation, which has been sort of like, you can find numerous different sources attesting to it. It's fairly consistent across a lot of texts, and we've been able to use like text from one part of the world to supplant the knowledge that we lack in other parts of the world. This story of Gilgamesh was apparently super popular. But as we talked about in our first lecture, like, it's also gradual in its development. There was certainly a tradition of Gilgamesh in the Sumerian writings. Heck, it seems that Gilgamesh was actually a person, like he was an actual king who ruled in roughly 2700 BCE, and it's just stories about this dude that like get circulated and get written down all the time. So first you have these sort of disconnected myths about Gilgamesh. Hey, that time that he and Enkidu went to the underworld. Or hey, that time he and Enkidu fought the Bull of Heaven. Or hey, that time he and Enkidu fought like Humbaba. And some of the time, like honestly most of the time, these really early Gilgamesh stories have Enkidu not as like his friend and equal, but as like his primary servant. Like, he is the steward of Gilgamesh's kingdom, and consequently, like, Gilgamesh will go on an adventure and, like, leave Enkidu behind to, like, run the show. But by the later period, by, like, the Akkadian writings and by the 2nd century BCE, there is an official epic of Gilgamesh, the one that we read that has been sort of, like, buttressed by these other stories, as well as, like, other epics. And it's pretty well codified at this point. Like, you have the story of how Enkidu is the wild man created by the gods, and he and Gilgamesh square off, but they become best friends, and they fight Humbaba, and so on and so forth. But like I said, Gilgamesh is super popular. Like, you can find references to him all throughout the ancient world, and not just, like, in the ancient world. Like, we're not talking about just a Bronze Age hero. Like, the Greeks are still talking about him in some of their texts well after the Sumerian and Babylonian empires have kind of collapsed. Additionally, you can find like pictorial representations of him all throughout the ancient world. Like down here, this is a cylinder seal. Like, you know how you have those like wax seals on like a ring or something, the signet ring. Like some king will sign the document with his ring to indicate that, like, yes, only he could have produced this because only he has the ring that makes this impression. The Babylonians use these cylinders instead, and you would like roll them on the wax, which is honestly super cool if you ask me, but it means that now we get like pictures of Gilgamesh fighting a lion, super awesome, and you just like put that on things for whatever reason, either because it's cool or because of some sort of like formal purpose. Again, not sure, not my area. But I want to stress, like, as much as we read the Epic of Gilgamesh because it is one of the most coherent works of the super ancient world, we've also got to stress that it is, in fact, super popular. Like, it's one that a lot of people talk about. It's not just this random thing that people discovered. No, it is well attested in a lot of different places. But like I said, Gilgamesh is a Sumerian hero who is adopted by other cultures, specifically the Akkadians. Again, if the sort of like core of the Sumerian world was between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Akkadians sort of grew up nearby, invaded the territory, and kind of very much just made it their own. So they quickly conquered much of the rest of the ancient, like, Fertile Crescent world, all the way up towards Anatolia, including Cyprus itself. Many of these conquests were conducted by this dude, Sargon the Great, represented here with this famous mask of his. Under Sargon, the priority of the, Sumerian world shifted from the sort of scientific and literary accomplishments to very much like warmongering and conquest and, fortifying the territory that they had conquered and protecting it from outside invaders, which is pretty dang appropriate at this point. The world's getting smaller, and as much as Sumer and was protected by like deserts in the Arabian Peninsula and, some pretty impassable mountains to the east, like, this was necessary now that Egypt is growing stronger, now that new factions are developing, like the Hittites or the Hurrians, now that the Canaanites are getting, occasionally aggressive. All this to say that, like, this actually makes the empire stronger in some respect, even if it does kind of reduce the cultural accomplishments that are being conducted. But one note here about the architecture of this Babylonian world. As much as, yes, like, Sargon is doing his best to, like, fortify his new conquests, I gotta stress, Babylonian architecture tends to be fairly lackluster at the end of the day. Like, this is probably one of the most famous Babylonian constructions that is still standing today. The Ziggurat of Ur, first constructed in, like, 2100 BCE and still standing in modern-day Iraq. This ziggurat is one of several, like, multiple major urban centers across the, like, fledgling Akkadian Empire have these ziggurats as sort of like major temple structures, sort of center of the city. Oftentimes there's a shrine or some sort of temple on the top of the ziggurat, where, people will worship their various gods. What is noteworthy about the ziggurat, though, is that it is made of brick. Like, the Fertile Crescent here in the Tigris and Euphrates River, it is a river valley. Like, it is between groups of mountains, desert on one end, mountains on the other. There's not a whole heck of a lot of stone to be had without going some pretty impressive distances and having to trek it over some pretty rough territory. So, as a rule, the Babylonians don't build grand edifices like the Egyptians do, or like the Mycenaeans do. The Babylonians basically build the most basic structures that they can come up with. The ziggurats are the one major exception and a sign of the greater power and wealth that they're accumulating under the Akkadian Empire. But if you're trying to find, like, what does the average Mesopotamian house look like in 2000 BCE, there's no archaeological evidence because a lot of these buildings fell apart because they were made of inferior materials, or they didn't stand up to scrutiny, or they were destroyed really easily. What archaeological evidence we do have indicates that it was very basic. Like, they used the most basic post and lintel structure, like, literally, like, we're going to put up posts and we're going to put, like, more posts, horizontally on top of them. Like, we're going to basically build Jenga towers or Lincoln log towers out of whatever we have to hand. Again, usually brick, possibly wood. Like, that's it. So Babylonian architecture doesn't have nearly the lasting power of many of the like Egyptian monuments or Mycenaean monuments. There are exceptions, we'll talk about them, but those are usually the result of like the Babylonian Empire after the Bronze Age collapse. We'll talk about how Nebuchadnezzar sort of like begins his own sort of building campaign here. For now, know that there are some important Babylonian monuments, but they're not necessarily what the Babylonians are remembered for here in the Bronze Age. As the Bronze Age continues, though, and as we enter the late Bronze Age, the Babylonian Empire does start to kind of fragment and dissolve a bit. There are other people who are sort of like breaking off from the Babylonians, like the Hittites or the Assyrians. Some of these people are like also composed of invaders from other territories. Babylon is shrinking by 1200 BCE, at which point it's going to shrink a whole lot more. But it remains sort of one of the central powers in the ancient world. It remains, you know, like recognized, and obviously its cultural footprint is fairly large, if again the Gilgamesh epic is any indication. So again, Babylon is kind of the obvious place to start here. It is the legacy of the earliest written culture. It is the legacy of some of the earliest civilized cultures, some of the earliest agricultural cultures. It is absolutely going to keep haunting us as the semester goes on. But we should turn our attention to culture number 2, the Egyptians. You've probably heard quite a bit more about the Egyptians at this point. Like, I know that this is a fairly popular subject for, like, high school world history or Western Civ courses, or possibly even earlier, now that those are kind of being phased out. What I want to stress about ancient Egypt is, again, we're dealing with a culture that changes over time. Earliest ancient Egyptian culture very much hails back to, like, the 3000s BCE, like the pre-dynastic kingdoms of ancient Egypt. But you should also notice that, like, when we talk about Egypt, we talk about Lower Egypt and we talk about Upper Egypt. And yes, Lower Egypt is to the north, Upper Egypt is to the south. This is because the Nile flows north, unlike most rivers in the world, weirdly enough. So consequently, Lower Egypt is where it is lower lying. It is where the Nile is dumping out into the Mediterranean, and it is importantly where the Nile floods. And again, agriculture is everything here. Because the Nile floods, it means that it is regularly irrigating land with no effort from you and your friends. Isn't that nice? So the Nile is going to regularly refresh its nutrients. It's regularly going to, you know, like fertilize the soil. It's regularly going to produce even better crop yields. And that's part of why Lower Egypt is going to be incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful. Upper Egypt, on the other hand, is rocky. It is tougher terrain, but the Nile flows through it, which means all those problems we had in Babylon, finding like rock and important like metals like copper and tin, which are crucial to making bronze, Egypt is going to have that in spades, because all you have to do is like sail down the Nile a little ways, or rather sail up the Nile a little ways, and you're suddenly going to find all of these really great places where you can find gold, where you can find copper, where you can find stone in great abundance. So Egypt kind of has the best of both worlds here, but the Egyptian world is narrow. Like, there is just desert and rocky territory and ugly territory on either end. So stay near the Nile or run the risk of dissolution. Now, timeline-wise, again, the Egyptians are developing. They are not one monolithic culture. The way we usually discuss Egyptian culture is in terms of its kingdoms. There is this pre-dynastic period in like 3000 BCE to like 2700 BCE, at which point we start the Old Kingdom, like the first great culture of Egypt. which does in fact fall apart after like 500 years and gives us the first intermediate period. Then we have the Middle Kingdom, another period of great wealth, another period of great stability, followed by a second intermediate period of great instability, followed by finally the New Kingdom, which is where, much of Egypt's greatest cultural accomplishments and greatest wealth occurs. At which point, again, the Bronze Age collapse brings around the third intermediate period, and things start to go downhill for the Egyptians. They're still going to be a major power for quite a while. They're still going to influence the Greeks for quite a while. We'll get to that in its own right. But for now, keep in mind, we got three kingdoms, old, middle, and new, separated by several intermediate periods where things are unstable. But what is interesting about the Egyptians is that where, like, the Babylonians definitely shift their culture radically over time when the Akkadians conquer it or when it fragments, the Egyptians, basically due to their regular, Nile flood routine, managed to keep their culture, managed to keep their gods for quite a while. Like, the stability here is impressive. And consequently, like, there is going to be more consistency across their language, across their literature, across their art, across their civilization than in many of the other ancient cultures at the same time. So the characteristic writing style of the Egyptians is this hieroglyphic system. And hieroglyphics, again, you'll notice that, like, when we talked about early Sumerian writing, it seemed awful similar to hieroglyphics. And many scholars argue that the Egyptians are, in fact, borrowing the pictograph system from the Mesopotamians to develop their hieroglyphic system. Not everybody is in agreement here, but that seems to be the scholarly consensus at the moment. The hieroglyphics, though, are tough to reproduce. Again, it's got that whole pictorial system, and it is very quickly codified because it is usually involved with, like, ritual and especially, like, funerary proceedings. There is very little interest in sort of changing the hieroglyphic system. So where the Sumerian system gradually becomes more and more abstracted, gradually becomes more and more syllabic, and becomes more and more flexible, the Egyptian system gets stuck in hieroglyphic mode and becomes harder and harder to replicate as other cultures are sort of moving beyond this kind of system. So it is inflexible, it is a little slower to change, it is very much slower to adapt, and as a result, the literary tradition of the Egyptians is a little stunted in that respect. Like, they create a great abundance of literature in the sense of coffin texts and funerary texts and writings about how to prepare, like, bodies. There are tons of scientific treatises. Like, the Egyptians have some of the greatest medicine of the ancient world, such that, like, when the Greeks start doing medicine with the likes of Hippocrates, they're absolutely, like, stealing tons of information from the Egyptians. They are absolutely, like, dwarfed by the Egyptians' accomplishments at this point. So there is plenty of this out there, but it is kind of limited in its scope. What we see here is the Last Judgment of Hunefer, which, again, we watched the Khan Academy video on this, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But notice that this also is typical of many Egyptian compositions. The hieroglyphics are paired with the illustrations. And consequently, to say that, like, oh, we want to read the text but ignore the pictures, that's nonsense from an Egyptian standpoint. And you'll notice in our next reading, when you start approaching the Book of the Dead, there are passages where literally our translator is going to, like, stop everything, stop translating in the sense of, like, trying to come up with a word-for-word gloss for all of the hieroglyphics that are being presented, and instead describe, okay, this is what the picture says. Like, this is what is depicted there. It's what our translator calls a vignette. So this makes it fairly difficult to, again, transpose or translate Egyptian writing because, again, the picture is crucial to the understanding of the text. Our guy Hunefer here, there's definitely text relating to his journey through the underworld, but notice that each of the writings is connected to who is he talking to, who does he have to get past, which isn't easily communicated. Notice this in the Book of the Dead, because in the Book of the Dead, there is, in fact, a long passage where, one of the people is trying to, like, get past a number of different, judges, and he's got a specific thing to say to each judge, and like it is presented here, it's probably arranged in such a way that like the text itself is paired with the individual judges, something that makes way more sense looking at the picture than it will when you're just reading it for the sake of this class. So yeah, keep that in mind as you tackle the Book of the Dead. A actual perfect translation does not exist and probably could not exist in that respect. But obviously the major claim to fame of the Egyptian culture, the thing that we remember the most today, is the architecture. These huge monuments commemorating the deaths of the various pharaohs. The pyramids at Giza in particular are still considered one of the greatest wonders of the world today, and one of the few that survive from the ancient world. Certainly one of the few that survive intact as well as they do. The whole pyramid complex here is largely constructed during Old Kingdom Egypt. Again, slave labor is a major part of how this probably occurred. But also, you'll notice that like other famous monuments like these step pyramids or the Sphinx are also connected. They're all in the same complex, like they're all within walking distance of one another. But it's also worth noting that, like, the sheer scale of these suckers, the scope of these pyramids is just enormous compared to like the ability of humans to produce works like monuments of this nature today. They're also mathematically amazing. Like over and over as I was researching them, the sort of thing that the scholars and the sort of like observers of this culture kept mentioning is that like the balance, the shape of the stones, the cut, the sides of the pyramids, they are identical within like inches. Like we couldn't do this today without painstaking work. Like we could not duplicate these monuments the way that the Egyptians had produced them, and we are still kind of baffled about how it is that they were able to, you know, accomplish this level of precision, as well as the sheer monumental task of being able to create something this massive with ancient technologies and very limited like construction capabilities. But we should note that as much as these are the hallmarks of the Old Kingdom, they are not the hallmarks of the New Kingdom. As Egypt developed, its interest in architecture shifted, and rather than develop these huge pyramids, basically made from cut stone and like built from scratch, instead we are gradually working towards these palaces or temples. Again, they are constructed to commemorate the dead. The theory of most of Egyptian culture is that like the afterlife is more important than actual life on Earth, and therefore guaranteeing yourself a good afterlife is a huge priority for the Egyptians. In the Old Kingdom, the afterlife is largely reserved for pharaohs and possibly their immediate servants. But by the New Kingdom, it's kind of assumed that, like, actually everyone gets to go to the afterlife. You just gotta, you know, protect yourself from thieves and make sure that your body is preserved. So, you know, middle-class people, scribes, and bureaucrats, they're getting embalmed too, and they're being put in palaces, often nearby the pharaohs, because they think they've got, like, better luck of you know, surviving in the afterlife if they're like connected to a pharaoh. But this one is probably like the high watermark of New Kingdom construction. This is the funerary temple of Hatshepsut. And I gotta stress, like I said at the outset, it's rare that we get to talk about women in this class. Hatshepsut is awesome, and she builds herself a freaking awesome temple in order to commemorate how awesome she is. As a rule, like, there aren't a lot of Egyptian queen pharaohs. Again, there's like 5 or 6 of them over the course of Egyptian history compared to like the hundreds of male pharaohs. And honestly, the Egyptians are really nervous about female pharaohs. Like 3 or 4 of them come right at the beginning of like major instability in Egypt. And it's like the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom and the last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom are both women. And consequently, by the New Kingdom, it's like, uh-oh, we got a woman pharaoh. It's like, this is one of the signs of the apocalypse. Better batten down the hatches. At which point you gotta wonder, like, how much of this is, yeah, the women screwed over the kingdom, and how much of this is, yeah, we think the women are gonna screw over the kingdom, so we're gonna, like, bail and the kingdom will collapse under us. So, yay for anticipated misogyny justifying misogyny. At any rate, Hatshepsut is cool, her funeral temple is cool, this is what the ancient kingdoms are sort of like working their way towards, and while many a scholar has argued that it is not the case, you might very well think that there are connections between the way that these sort of like columns and, simple round columns here sort of inspire the columnar architecture of ancient Greece and Rome as well. It's complicated, it's messy, maybe in the later patterns when the Greeks are in fact like paying attention to what the Greeks or what the Egyptians are doing, but it does seem like the Greeks come up with their own columnar architecture all by themselves without the help of the Egyptians. So there are clearly some really cool monuments here. Again, the Egyptians very much value the afterlife and very much spend a lot of time and effort trying to guarantee safe passage to that afterlife. But this is very much their legacy in the modern era, and these are very much things that continue to survive to this day and reveal sort of the genius of the Egyptian architects and the Egyptian infrastructure. But I also want to stress that as much as we are fascinated by Egyptian mythology, this is a typically more complicated business. We will bump into a lot of the Egyptian gods in the Book of the Dead. We will see Anubis, the judge, and Thoth, who is sort of like the scribe and caretaker for the whole underworld business, and Osiris, who famously died and came back from the dead, all relevant to our study in here. But I want to stress that in the study of mythology, in the study of gods, and sort of the stories surrounding them, fates and fortunes rise and fall, and with a long-lived culture as wide in scope as the Egyptians, stretching all the way from 3000 BCE to 1200 BCE and beyond, we're talking about a culture that has, over the course of its time, sort of devalued some of its gods and upgraded others. Earliest Egyptian records don't seem to think that Osiris is all that great. They instead seem to think that there's this really cool god, Atum, which is apparently the sun god, except that then Ra becomes the sun god, and then maybe Osiris graduates and becomes really important, where he wasn't important before, and then Atum, nobody even remembers who he is. It's messy, it's complicated, and probably the best way to explain this is to look at the situation of Akhenaten. This dude over here, and this is his wife over there, and these are apparently their kids and totally not aliens, even though obviously this is all the evidence you need that all of the pyramids were built by aliens and it was some flying saucer that deposited these weird alien children that did all the work for them. Nope, not true. All conspiracy nonsense. Please do not repeat any of this. This is a portrait of Akhenaten with his kids. Specifically his daughters, who are all apparently climbing over their mother and being kids and causing trouble like you do. But Akhenaten notably absolutely kicked out all of the Egyptian gods. It was actually really controversial, both in his own time and in the future. But he was actually Atum was the original god, and therefore Atum is the only god we're going to worship, and he's going to basically create his own kind of monotheism rather than the polytheism the Egyptians had practiced forever. And because he's the pharaoh, he's yeah, I want you to scratch out all of the occasions of all of the other gods. And he literally has all of these architects and priests going around scratching out the old images of the old gods to make sure that it's Atum and Atum only that anyone is worshipping. And then Nefertiti's, his wife, sort of carries on the legacy for a little while after her husband dies, but their son is you know what, screw that, we're going to bring all the old gods back. So they scratch out all the inscriptions to Atum. And again, this happens in the ancient Egyptian world. There is, as much as it is a stable culture for close to 2,000 years and change, it is not necessarily 100% stable, and the culture does shift. The way the gods are respected and understood does change as time goes on. Now, at this point, you may have other questions. But Professor Kozlowski, what about the Jews? Wasn't there that whole thing where, the Jews were in Egypt and they were slaves, and then Pharaoh was I'm going to kill all your kids, and then Moses showed up and he's let my people go, and the Egyptians are no, and he's do it anyway, or else I'm going to curse you with all these plagues. And then the plagues happen, there's blood and fire and frogs and lice, and the sun goes out. Yes there is, and we're not going to talk about it right now. What we're going to do instead is I want to get back around to Jews when we talk about Christians after the break. Like, we're going to get halfway through the class, the spring break, and then we're going to circle back around and talk about Judaism and Christianity, because at that point we will have gotten to, like, the end of the Roman Empire, and Christianity is about to become the biggest power on Earth. So we're going to have that conversation all at the same time, so we can talk about theological continuity, so we can, talk about, like, the greater snowballing historical effects, all that fun stuff. So for now, yes, the Jews are a thing. Scholars are really kind of divided about whether or not they were actually in Egypt, and if they were in Egypt, whether or not there was this whole plague thing. The Egyptians certainly aren't quick to tell us about it, which would be consistent with either it not happening or alternatively it being really embarrassing and them not wanting to admit that it occurred. So there's discussion and debate, and we're gonna wait on that until we handle it all at once. But this is also not the last time we're going to see the Jews bumping around the ancient world. The trouble with Judea and Israel is that it is basically the New Jersey of the entire ancient world. You gotta go through it in order to get anywhere else that you want to be. So if you're going to New York from Philadelphia, you gotta go through New Jersey. And if you're going to go from Egypt to Babylon, you're gonna go through Palestine. So yeah, the Jews are gonna get displaced and we're gonna bump into them frequently, but we're not gonna focus on them just yet. Patience, my doves. We will come to it. For now, I want to move on. Let's talk about the Bronze Age Greeks, because this admittedly is not like the most powerful civilization of the Bronze Age world, but it is going to be incredibly relevant to our class next discussion and beyond. Fortunately, I have this really great timeline of ancient Greece that I use in all my other classes because it's wonderful, and it really just compacts the whole discussion really nicely. So, the Bronze Age Greek world was divided into three parts. The Kykladics were the people hanging out on the actual islands, the archipelago in the middle of the Aegean. The Minoans are the ones who hang out on Crete, the big giant island at the south of the Aegean. And the Mycenaeans are those who hang out on the mainland, the peninsula, the Peloponnesus of Greece. And they each have kind of distinct cultures, but they also will eventually just sort of like fold into one another and become the Greeks as we understand it. Though I should be hesitant about that because the Greeks aren't actually like a unified nation or a unified culture until basically Alexander the Great says that they are. It'll get complicated when we talk about the Trojan War. Wait for it. But for now, again, three cultures: the Kykladics, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans. And they each have their own distinct art as well. The Kykladics do not have access to very good clay, their materials are pretty weak, and consequently their sculpture tends to be pretty simplistic. There are exceptions. There is one particular oil holder that is absolutely mind-boggling, and you can go see it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art if you're so inclined. But generally speaking, most of their carvings tend to be pretty rudimentary. They're pottery. You can see like the one vase over here. Very simplistic, basic geometric designs, like it's barely holding together. The Kykladics, as a rule, are the weakest and sort of easiest to conquer of the ancient Greek civilizations, although, ironically, they're also the earliest, and most of the figures we have from ancient Greece, dating from like 2000 BCE and earlier, come from the Kykladic Islands. The Minoans, on the other hand, have a pretty robust trading empire, are pretty warlike, frequently take advantage of the Kykladics whenever they see fit. They're sailing all over the place, trading all over the place, pillaging all over the place. The Greeks are basically pirates at this point in history, and will continue to be for quite a while. But the great thing about the Minoans is that they love putting like fish and like octopuses on their pottery, which means that you get like a pretty distinctive Minoan pattern and you have some pretty obvious Minoan artifacts. And what's super cool is that they're all over the Mediterranean because, again, the Minoans trade all over the place. So if you find an octopus vase, it's probably a Minoan relic, or alternatively, it's the Mycenaeans copying the Minoan formula, which they do. The Mycenaeans are probably the latest on the scene of the three cultures, and while the Minoans are probably the strongest, the Mycenaeans are very much copying their formula and very much kind of becoming up and running. Like, they're the up-and-comers here, I should say. The Minoans have a very sea-based civilization, but again, the Mycenaeans are on the mainland peninsula, so they've got their chariots. They're, warlike in their own way, but they're largely just going overland from place to place, despite the fact that ancient Greece is kind of lousy for land travel. The whole place is a rocky nightmare. Now, the one big hallmark of Mycenaean architecture is this megaron, these huge temple structures, most of which are destroyed at this point, but the archaeological evidence that can show us where, in fact, the structure used to be. This is an artist's recreation, like what they think that it probably looked like, and there's plenty of archaeological evidence to suggest that it's something like this. But the Mycenaeans used to build these huge structures, these huge buildings as sort of like central meeting halls, slash residences, slash who even knows, possibly they had like ritual purposes. Again, when archaeologists aren't sure what exactly is going on, they'll always say that there are ritual purposes here. So the Mycenaeans have this distinct architectural style, which you will see throughout the sort of Greek-influenced world, and you will see people copying it all throughout Europe as well. It's also a great way to sort of tell where the Greeks are expanding their culture, especially after the Bronze Dark Age. The other thing that we should definitely talk about, though, is the Trojan War. So, the Trojan War may or may not have happened. That's why I include the question mark up here. But we should definitely, emphasize what it would have looked like had it done so, because the Iliad is so influential and so powerful as a work of literature, as a text, and very much is supposed to occur during this Bronze Age period, that at least giving us some idea of what we're dealing with, so when we tackle Homer later, in the class, like next week, you can have a better picture of what's going on. According to the story of the Trojan War, according to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the other Trojan epics that sort of surrounded these texts, what basically happened, according to myth, is that Odysseus, one of the great heroes and one of the wiliest of the Greek leaders, apparently had this solution to a problem that was cropping up in the ancient Greek world. Specifically, there was this really, really, really beautiful princess, Helen, who would later be called Helen of Troy, who was supposedly the daughter of Zeus, because he had sex with Leda as a swan and then laid eggs. I don't know. The whole thing gets very messy. At any rate, Helen is really hot. Everybody wants to marry her, and her father's getting nervous because all of these dudes show up asking for her hand in marriage and getting a little rowdy about it. He's worried that they're going to start fighting each other, that whoever he marries Helen off to, she's going to get carried off or raped, or the husband will be murdered, and it's just going to all happen on his front step, and maybe he'll get murdered too. Odysseus shows up and he's like, I got a plan. If you marry me off to your second daughter, Penelope, who is also hot, but not quite as hot as Helen, I will make everybody agree to protect whatever person Helen ultimately marries. And they do. Every single Greek king, every single Greek lord who showed up on Helen's doorstep to marry her signs this oath to protect the marriage of Helen. And then the father of Helen draws by lot and says, okay, Helen, you're going to be married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, the Lacedaemonians. Yay! And Helen's like, okay, I don't care. And Menelaus is like, well, I win. Everyone else is like, boo, but we will abide by our oath. So everybody goes back home, everything seems to be okay, but then, again, according to mythology, the goddesses have a little bit of a spat. There's a beauty contest that needs to happen between Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera, and they get this guy, Paris, of Troy, to judge. Paris is not the brightest bulb in the box. He is very much a pretty boy with not a whole lot of intelligence. So they think that they can sway him by basically bribing him. And each of the goddesses bribes him differently. So Hera's if you, agree that I am the most beautiful of the goddesses, I will help you conquer all of Asia because all of Asia worships and respects me. And Paris is like, okay, sounds good, whatever. And Athena is like, I am the goddess of war, so if you choose me as the most beautiful, I will make sure you are always successful in warfare. And Paris is like, okay, warfare, sure, yeah, fighting, I get that, that's a thing. And then Aphrodite is like, hey, if you pick me as the most beautiful goddess, I am going to give you Helen, the most beautiful woman who ever lived. And Paris is like, you have my attention. I vote for Aphrodite. At which point, Aphrodite helps him to abduct Helen. He takes Helen from Lacedaemonia, Sparta, and sails her all the way up to Troy. At which point, now everyone who swore an oath to protect Helen's marriage has to band together and sail up to Troy and absolutely wreck the place. take Helen back to Lacedaemonia and destroy all the Trojans for doing this to them. This is the basic idea behind the Trojan War. This is what the epics always talk about. This is what Homer assumes that you know when you open the book. But I should stress, it probably didn't happen. The sheer level of organization to get like all of these people on the same page to sail all the way over to Troy, and then the fact that according to the legend, they're there for like 10 years. Like, this is a 30-year campaign. It's like 10 years to get the band together, and then it's 10 years over in Troy fighting the Trojans, and then it's like 10 years before everybody makes it back home, especially Odysseus, who is slow. No way. No way. None of the archaeologists think that this is remotely possible. But for all that, there is a city at the place that we call Troy, specifically Hisarlik, that's what we call it today, and quite a few of the cities that are identified in, the Greek world, like Mycenae, also exist. So there's probably some basis in truth and reality. Homer seems to know the basic geography of Troy at the very least, but Trojan War, probably not so much. Sorry, folks, but this is one of those cases where the fiction actually kind of overwhelms the fact. Like, people are convinced that Troy is a place for hundreds of years, and that the Trojan War actually occurred for thousands of years. Like, Caesars will come and visit Troy and be like, I am dedicating this temple because I, like the Trojans, am the greatest king who ever lived. And it's like, okay, that was never true, but whatever. If you believe it and it makes you happy, that's fine, Caesar. So suffice it to say, again, Trojan War probably didn't happen, but it kind of doesn't matter at some point, because when you write a book as awesome as the Iliad and then like take it to everybody and tell everybody how awesome it is and make them all read it and make them all like pay attention to the gods and pay attention to the story, eventually it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. People start treating it like it's true. Might as well be true in that case, and when we read it, I'm not going to expect you to like nitpick the details. I'm going to expect you to recognize the historical significance and the cultural significance here. And that one is pretty insurmountable. Like, the Iliad is the great work of the ancient world. It is probably the most famous work of ancient literature, with the possible exception of something like the Rig Veda in India, or possibly some of the great Chinese epics, most of which were written pretty well after Homer had written. So, Trojan War, not a thing. Iliad, very much a thing. Know the Iliad. Now, right after the events of the Trojan War are supposed to have occurred, the whole Bronze Age world falls apart. Like, I probably had you watch the extra history videos at this point, so I don't want to belabor the point. They do a really good job of describing all of the factions involved and all of the, like, potential dynamics involved. But what I want to emphasize is we don't know what the actual thing that happened went down. Like, this map suggests that it's because of the invasions of the Sea Peoples, and they've got, like, these specific lines showing where all the places where the Sea Peoples invaded. This is ambitious on the part of World History Encyclopedia, and I am not convinced that this is actually the way it went down. What I want to emphasize is something happened, and all of the empires that we've talked about fell apart. The Hittites, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, all gone. And basically overnight, like within 100 years, every single one of these empires had either fallen apart or been so severely weakened as to fall apart shortly afterwards, looking at you, Egypt. And again, we don't know why. Could have been the Sea Peoples, could have been famine, could have been that, what John Green in Crash Course History calls like an earthquake storm. Apparently some archaeologists think that like there were a series of earthquakes that occurred in quick succession, totally destabilizing the geology of the region, which led to even more destructive earthquakes. Hey, I don't know. Again, not my area. What I want you to know is that this is huge. And as much as we've been talking about all of these cultures and all of their influence, and as much as all of their written works are, things that we can read today, there's going to be this good 400-year period where nobody writes anything, where the pottery gets progressively more primitive instead of sophisticated, where trade basically grinds to a halt, and all of the interconnection between these disparate groups suddenly stops. It's weird, and we don't know for sure why it happened. Plenty of speculation occurs out there, but no one is convinced, no one is absolutely sure. But as much as this is what's frequently called the Bronze Dark Age, a lot happens during the Bronze Dark Age. And some of that we need to be aware of because it's going to inform, again, Homer and some of the other writings, especially of like the recovery period in the 8th to 6th centuries BCE, the stuff that we're going to talk about in the near future. So as far as the Greeks are concerned, the Mediterranean world changes fairly dramatically during the Bronze Dark Age. The Phoenicians, who up until this point have apparently not been a big deal, but suddenly like they start sailing all over the Mediterranean while there's this huge power vacuum in place, they very much start trade up again and are sort of single-handedly responsible for a lot of the trade that goes on in the new Bronze Dark Age world. They don't seem to have writing, and they don't really seem to track what they're doing. Like, they'll develop writing, and in fact it'll be from the Phoenicians that the Greeks inherit the sort of Sumerian alphabet and develop it into their own. But initially, the Phoenicians don't do a lot of writing. They just get around, and they start creating, like, cultural centers and colonies all throughout the Mediterranean world. You should, in particular, pay attention to this because one of the biggest sets of colonies is over here in Tunisia at the city of Carthage. And they're going to be a big player when we start talking about the Romans in a couple weeks. So keep in mind, Phoenicians mean Carthaginians, and they are going to eventually be the rivals of Rome. But as the Phoenicians are doing all of their colonizing and trading and colony building, the Greeks are too. The Greeks actually colonize most of Asia Minor, including the location of Troy, weirdly enough. They also, this map for some reason doesn't depict it, they also sail west and they start colonizing Italy, and they colonize much of the coast of the Mediterranean, of the Italian peninsula. Like, they get around, and consequently Greek culture and Greek civilization expands rapidly during the Bronze Dark Age, even though there aren't any written records of it. It's weird, and we're still not entirely sure what the process is here or why this happened. We just know that it did. And at least part of the reason why we know that it did is because we keep finding Greek artifacts in places where they don't belong. So, for example, this is the Cup of Nestor, one of my all-time favorite Greek artifacts of the archaic world. It was apparently constructed somewhere around the 8th century BCE, so after the Bronze Dark Age, and, writing is now back in circulation. The Phoenician language has sort of like filtered into Greek society, and the Greeks are writing again. But importantly, we've got this inscription on Nestor's cup that reads, "I am the cup of Nestor, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup, desire for beautifully crowned Aphrodite will seize him instantly." So it's a horny cup. But it's also, if you can't tell from the picture, it's a child's cup. Like, it's a kid's cup. Which indicates a lot to us. First off, like, hey, we made this fun cup for kids where, like, the kid can pick up the cup and feel as awesome and strong as Nestor. Like, there's even this thing in the Iliad where, like, Nestor has this cup that's so awesome that only Nestor is strong enough to pick it up. Which is weird on a lot of levels, but, like, don't question it. At the very least, what it means is, like, little kid gets to pick up Nestor's cup and feel like a badass because, he can hold the cup that only Nestor can pick up. But notice what that means as well about the story and its transmission. Like, apparently the Iliad, or at least this one detail of the whole story of the Trojan War, has become so popular that, like, random people are inscribing this on people's cups because we want to feel as awesome as Nestor does in this story that apparently we know and that apparently everybody knows. Which is kind of fascinating, especially when you consider that this cup was not found in Greece. It was found in Sicily, the island to the south of the Italian peninsula, which means that the Greeks must be over there. Like, not only has Greek culture spread to, Italy, but, like, Greek pottery styles and Greek, cultural details are all over there as well. So the Greeks have expanded dramatically, and they've brought their culture with them. The story of the Iliad and the Odyssey apparently have been transmitted for the last 400 years. Heck, in all likelihood, this story was invented during the Bronze Dark Age, communicated orally, and finally just starting to be written down when Homer writes the Iliad and the Odyssey. But enough about the Greeks for now. We will come back to them in the coming weeks. What I want to focus on are all of our civilizations that we talked about earlier, especially the civilizations in the ancient Near East, now that they are growing and developing in the wake of the Bronze Dark Age. And the first civilization that really gets going in the like post Bronze Dark Age world is the Assyrians. Like, the Assyrians had already been a thing. They had sort of fragmented off of Babylon quite a while ago. But in the 7th century, the Assyrians are sort of like the first ones to get their horses going again. Like, they realize that, hey, we don't need to ride in chariots. We can just ride on horseback. And apparently this is like this technological development that literally no one could figure out. So, like, their heavy cavalry starts sweeping through the entire Fertile Crescent, and they manage to conquer, like, most of Lower Egypt, most of Babylonia. Like, the Assyrian Empire is short-lived, but it is scary fast in its spread. The Assyrians are straight up warlike, though. Most of their art, most of their culture surrounds, like, talking about their great, like, war accomplishments. Most of their statuary and depictions of themselves are usually, like, we are super strong, and here is, like, me on the head of a bull that is also flying, the Lamassu. Or, you know, we have that Khan Academy video about, like, the Greek king fighting the lions. Like, this is what the Assyrians very much emphasize about themselves. We don't have anything nearly as, like, complicated or sophisticated as, like, the Iliad of the Greeks, or the Book of the Dead of the Egyptians, or the Gilgamesh of the Mesopotamians. Again, the Assyrians are just out for blood, conquest, all of that. And as much as this, like, poses a huge threat to all of these sorts of back-broken cultures of the ancient world, they do manage to pretty quickly turn it around and sort of, like, fight the Assyrians off. So Babylon in particular manages to profit dramatically from sort of overcoming the Assyrians and just basically supplanting themselves in the Assyrian Empire. The Egyptians, like, also managed to fight off the Assyrians and guarantee their autonomy, but they aren't nearly the power they used to be, and they aren't nearly as influential as they were, except for the Greeks, who do seem to have ongoing trade with them. The Babylonians managed to spread throughout the Fertile Crescent, though. Like, all throughout the Arabian Peninsula, this is the Babylonians' golden age in a very real sense. So around 600 BCE, they have spread to their widest, and their greatest kings, Nebuchadnezzar I and Nebuchadnezzar II, are starting to rule and conduct great works, and this becomes the great civilization to envy in the ancient world. Some of this can be commemorated on things like these kudurus. They're sort of like or freestanding pillars with a bunch of writing on the one end and sort of pictures on the other. In this case, this kuduru talks about, like, one of the raids of Nebuchadnezzar I and talks about how awesome he is and all that. But probably the even more famous accomplishments are by Nebuchadnezzar II. He apparently has his whole, like, infrastructure spree where he reconstructs the ancient hanging gardens of Babylon and, like, brings them up to this level and glory that, like, the world has never seen before. The hanging gardens are widely considered one of the great wonders of the ancient world, and, like, everybody wants to see these things, and it's a real sign of Nebuchadnezzar's opulence. He is also the one who contracts the Ishtar Gate, which we, again, watched a Khan Academy video on the Ishtar Gate and how it emphasizes, like, hey, Nebuchadnezzar built this because he's a badass and you don't mess with him. So Nebuchadnezzar's legacy looms large over the new Babylonian Empire. But we should note that this is another place where the, historical record bumps into the biblical record. And Nebuchadnezzar is kind of the villain of a lot of stories in the Bible, especially in the book of Daniel, because part of that Babylonian conquest included taking over Palestine, which had been largely autonomous during the Dark Age, and sort of, like, snuck in and took over the Canaanite world and, founded their own culture and founded their own kingship. We'll get to it. Wait for it. The next empire that really starts to spread, though, is the Persian Empire. The Persians have been over in, like, the eastern world, like, closer to India and the Indus River for a while now, but they have gradually been spreading west. They also have sort of been pioneering this light cavalry system, this sort of, like, hit and fade tactics where you go in, you hit hard, you've got a light infantry so they can strike fast, sack a city in record time, and if in fact, like, some major heavy infantry or heavy cavalry show up, they can retreat and be gone before anyone knows that they were there. This is what's known as Parthian tactics in sort of like the history of military endeavors, because Parthia. So the Persians spread rapidly, and the Persians conquer basically the entire Babylonian Empire and set themselves up as the new rulers of the ancient world. Under a number of kings, in particular Cyrus the Great, who wages multiple campaigns and manages to conquer a great deal of territory, as well as Cambyses II, who manages to conquer much of Egypt and Arabia, the Persian Empire becomes the new power of the ancient world, even more impressive than the Babylonian Empire that preceded it. This is their golden age. But unlike the Babylonians, who kind of disintegrate after the Medo-Persians very much take them over, after this Achaemenid Persian Empire, the Persians are going to stick around. We're going to hear from them again. So put a pin in this. The historical world is not done with the Persians. But also the Persians are going to be bumping into the Greeks over here, which means we're going to be hearing about them next week when the Greeks actually start going to war with them. It's messy, it's complicated, we'll talk about it more later. For now, I want to focus on the career of our guy Cyrus the Great. Again, he is well known in the ancient world. He is another sort of egomaniac conqueror who absolutely erects all of these monuments to himself. But Cyrus also kind of poses himself as a liberator. Like, again, he's the one who conquers the Babylonians. So anyone who had been enslaved by the Babylonians is freed by the Medo-Persians because Cyrus the Great is just so damn benevolent and awesome. Which also bumps into the biblical record. In the book of Ezra in particular, it talks about how Cyrus frees the Jews from their captivity in Babylon, restores them to Jerusalem, and helps them rebuild the temple. This is not necessarily selfless on Cyrus's part. Having a buffer state to get in the way if the Egyptians ever want to invade the Persians is pretty convenient on his part. He is perfectly happy to let the Jews say that they have autonomy and also still demand tribute from them from time to time. The Persians are like that, though. They're interested in religious freedom and autonomy, and they let a lot of people kind of like worship their own gods however they like, including the Jews. They're pretty cool that way. But they also like taking a lot of slaves, and their bureaucratic structure is pretty inflexible. So, a little of this, a little of that. But at least part of the reason why they are so flexible with their religion is because the Persians have been adopting this monotheistic religion called Zoroastrianism for quite a while now. Zoroastrianism in its earliest origins probably dates back to like 2500 BCE, which means it's roughly as old as like the earliest cultures in Babylon or in ancient Egypt. It could very well have existed just around the same time as the Vedas are being produced in India, certainly some of the later Vedas at least. But Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion. According to the teachings of Mishra, if I'm not mistaken, well, it starts as Zoroaster or Zarathustra. Zarathustra says that, like, hey, there's this god Mishra, he is the only good god, and he is the only god worth worshipping. There's this evil god that you guys should all, like, fight against, and if you support Mishra against the evil god, then, like, good things will happen to you and you'll have a happy afterlife. But if you oppose him, then you'll probably end up with a bad afterlife if you have an afterlife at all. This is worth noticing because as much as this is an ancient religion and as much as we didn't talk about it in its own proper time, I want you to know that the Zoroastrians are a thing because they're going to actually become more popular later. Like, as much as this is the dominant religion of the dominant culture in the ancient world, one of the principles underlying Zoroastrianism is that you just let people do their own thing. If they're not worshiping Mishra, that's their loss, but it's not like your responsibility to indoctrinate them or anything. So if the Jews want to worship their god, fine, whatever. If the Egyptians want to worship their weird pantheon of, like, animal-headed gods, go ahead, be our guest. But at the end of the day, we know the truth. The truth is there's one God. He's awesome. We should only worship him. And if you do, then you're going to end up having a really good afterlife. So why ask questions? Again, keep this in mind because there's almost certainly some connections to be made to Judaism and Christianity here. And the Romans are really going to get excited about Zoroastrianism at one point in their history as well. So this is where we're going to leave the Bronze Age and the great ancient world, the, like, recovery period, the early Iron Age after the Bronze Age has collapsed. A lot of this is really just groundwork. Like, I want us to understand who the major players here. Remember the Babylonians, remember the Egyptians, remember the Greeks, remember the Persians. They will, again, factor heavily into our discussions further on, and they will keep haunting us as we go. And importantly, their culture and their legacy continues to persist to this day. You know, as much as the Sumerians were pretty quickly conquered in our story, they did produce the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this became the flagship cultural landmark of the Akkadian and the Babylonian empires. People kept reading about Gilgamesh and talking about Gilgamesh well into the first few centuries AD. As much as the Egyptians are not going to necessarily be the foundation of the Roman Empire and the European worldview, it is their research in medicine, their research in, studying the stars and building a calendar that will ultimately be adopted by the Greeks and the Romans and ultimately the Western world at large. And it is the apparently weirdo religion of the Persians, which, didn't enter this story until the very end, that will probably be foundational to understanding Christianity and its development as the dominant religion of the Western world for centuries to come. As much as these empires and cultures sort of rose and fell and do not have the lasting influence of the Greeks and the Romans, they are the people who influence the Greeks and Romans. And in inheriting the Greek and Roman culture, we inherit these as well. Be aware of that, and be aware of the assumptions that each one of them are making. For our next discussion, we're going to be looking at some of the texts from a number of these different cultures. Like I said, we're going to be reading from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We're going to be looking at the Babylonian/Sumerian story of Inanna venturing into the underworld, which is almost certainly predating the Epic of Gilgamesh as we have it, and is, again, a great little underworld story about someone venturing into the underworld and getting into trouble. And we're going to be looking at probably the most famous of these three, at least the most enduringly famous of these three, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is a foundational Greek myth, one that probably dates back to the Bronze Age, though no written record exists of it until well after the Bronze Age collapse and the Bronze Dark Age. But importantly, it is going to be foundational to our understanding of the Greek afterlife, and it is going to be influential in the gradual evolution of the Greek afterlife, as we will talk about later. So read those three for next time. We will talk about them in our next lecture. I look forward to talking about it with you soon.